So once again, we are back here on Living in the 21st Century. Joining me today is John B. Kelly, Director for Second Thoughts in Massachusetts. Also joining me today is Anita Cameron, not dead yet, Director of Minority and Outreach in Massachusetts. John, Anita, it's a pleasure having you here today. And I'm quite sure there's a lot going on in the health world. And I want to look at one of the topics that often bothers me, and this is assisted suicide. It seems to me for a long time, this was something that they had been trying to get past here, that it's okay to take a person's life and so forth. I know it's a very up topic that some people don't like to talk about, and some people do like to talk about. So my question goes out to you first, John. Tell us a little bit more about this bill with assisted suicide, because I just don't seem to understand, and I can tell you from my experience quickly. I grew up as a kid, and I took care of my grandmother hygiene. She had a stroke. She couldn't do anything for herself. And in this young generation, it simply appears that if there's no money passing, if there's no kind of income coming to the person, you're not getting taken care of. What's going on? I mean, it's a different world altogether, but tell me a little bit what's really going on.
Sure, Errol, and thank you so much for having us on. This is an important conversation. And what we have found is that the group of people who are pushing for legalization of assisted suicide tend to be upper middle class, white, educated professionals. And they are trying to get their own idea of dignity and indignities put into law. The first law was passed in Oregon in 1997, and since then, 9 more states and the District of Columbia, where Washington, the capital, is, have passed similar laws. And basically, the hook they hang this assisted death on is people being quote unquote terminally ill, which is something very, very difficult to estimate. And that is 2 doctors agreeing that the person has 6 months or less to live. But what has happened, and it's obvious looking at reports of the various states, is that doctors report that people are using assisted suicide because of their own internalized ableism. And by that, I mean when people start to need assistance with activities of daily living, especially toileting, that people feel like they would rather be dead. And so, some of the concerns are feeling like a burden, losing control of bodily functions, as in poop and pee, feeling loss of dignity. And the group of this people, as I said, are wealthier white people. These bills are resisted by working class people of all races and ethnicity, and especially by Black and brown people. And with that, I'll pass it on to Anita.
Yes, Anita. Could you elaborate a little bit on this? Because as a Black person, I've grown up my life, and I recognize in our culture when someone becomes disabled in the family, that it was an honor to take care of that person. There wasn't any form of disgruntledness. We took pleasure in nursing that person back to either good care, or if they remain in that state, we stood with them through thin and thick until they passed. And it was no need for assisted suicide. So Anita, give me your take on this.
for as far as I'm concerned, I mean, assisted suicide is just not. It's not Black culture. That's not something that we do. I mean, we take care of our own whenever possible, and we depend on family and community, and all of that. Um, and that certainly remains true for poor and working class Black folks. But however, compassionate choices, and they're the leading folks who are proponents of assisted suicide in this country, um, unfortunately has made a lot of inroads into Black and brown communities, particularly Black communities. And they have seemed to catch on in the Black professional community. And I think it's because sometimes of our desire to assimilate into dominant culture. We kind of accept those, I think, as a part of assimilating into the dominant culture and kind of moving into the professional class. It's frightening, but there are more and more Black folks who are accepting this, but certainly among Black disabled and Black poor folks and working class folks, we're still overwhelmingly against doctor-assisted suicide.
John, back to you. Do you think this assisted suicide that is now somewhat plaguing medical institutions to have an overall impact on how society as a whole view life and when they should cease to exist?
Yes, very much. We just had a couple of reports by National Public Radio that out in Oregon, which has had legalized assisted suicide for the longest, that intellectually disabled people who got COVID or looked like they might have COVID were being taken to the hospital, and doctors were refusing to treat people based on this phrase. This is a deadly phrase, and it's called quality of life. So, for example, a vivacious, life-loving woman named Sarah McSweeney, who was intellectually disabled but was larger than life. She loved going to the mall and doing girly things like getting her nails and hair done. And the hospital just flat out refused to treat her because of her quality of life. And the doctor said, well, can she walk or talk? As if that is the basis for whether someone is worth keeping alive. And this was done in the absence of any scarcity. States came up with these so-called crisis standards of care that they would deny care to people who were disabled or very old in favor of saving that care for other more deserving people. But they just started denying care willy-nilly. And I am, you could say, the poster boy for better dead than disabled, because I am publicly described as paralyzed from the neck down. And there are so many movies and novels about people like me demanding the right to die. You know, whether it's Me Before You, Whose Life Is It Anyway, The Sea Inside, $1 Million Baby. They always show people like me demanding to be killed. And what these bills are doing is just putting into law the prejudice against us. And leading bioethicists like Thaddeus Pope, who I debated in September, he predicts that it will be extended to disabled people who are who are not terminal, and that's what just happened in Canada. Canada is passing this bill known as C7, which extends the ability for disabled people who are not even thought to be dying to receive a lethal injection. And after a 2-year study, they're also going to extend it to people whose only so-called malady is having a mental health diagnosis. So they're coming for us. It's real. And what we have to do is get our message out that we are the ones who get to determine the quality of our lives, not these prejudiced people spreading hate and death on our community.
Well, exactly. I mean, they're one thing you always taught me. Every day above ground is a good day. And I believe that if you have a good heart inside your body beating, you are alive, and that's good quality of life, despite of whatever the disabilities may be. Then, who is man to state whether someone's life doesn't deserve to exist simply because they may be disabled? You may very well be comfortable in how you're living. Who am I or a next person to decide whether you get to live or die? It just doesn't make sense to me. Is there any forms of combat against this activity right now? Is there anyone speaking against it? Or are they going to just settle and just let this pass?
Well, we are trying to reach progressives who unfortunately have come under the influence of groups like Compassion and Choices. And this group used to be called the Hemlock Society, but they changed their name to market their product better. And it's really, it's a form of white supremacy in that these wealthier people are trying to force their views on the rest of us. And the problem is that every institution in this country, practically, except the military, is run by these upper class white people. Whether you're talking about social worker groups, medical groups, legislators, the media, they talk to each other in this bubble, and that leaves out poor people, black and brown people. And maybe Anita could follow from there.
Sure.
Well, what's frightening is, John was speaking earlier about crisis standards of care. I'll tell you a case that really affected me, personally, and that made national news. In Texas, there was a gentleman named Michael Hickson who became a paraplegic as a result of a heart attack. And he was in rehab, and they decided that he didn't need any more rehab and was sent to a nursing home. At that nursing home, he contracted COVID-19. And when it came time to treat him, when he was transferred to hospital and it was time to treat him, the treating physician refused to do so, specifically because of his disabilities, because he could not walk. And at the time, Texas wasn't even, they got to the position where crisis standards of care and things could be applied. But at this point, they hadn't even reached that phase yet. And Michael Hickson was refused treatment and placed in hospital. And the thing is that Michael Hickson kind of is the face of that, but how many more Michael Hicksons are there that we don't know of? COVID has really laid bare medical discrimination, disability discrimination in healthcare, and racial disparities in healthcare. Certainly here in the United States, the Black community in particular has been ravaged by COVID-19. Blacks in particular, and Black and brown folks, Indigenous folks are dying at twice the rates of white folks. And so what has happened is that Compassionate Choices has been kind of making a move to kind of push COVID as a terminal illness, thereby making people who contract COVID-19 eligible for assisted suicide. And they're even, trying to get this done by telemedicine. In Washington State, which it has it's the second state in this country that enacted assisted suicide laws. They're wanting to expand now who can give the drugs, provide the drugs, that you can even mail them in. I mean, it's really frightening. And although now in this country, Blacks and Latina community in particular overwhelmingly oppose assisted suicide. And so there aren't very many Black and brown folks throughout the country who are requesting assisted suicide. As it is now, until California and Colorado and the District of Columbia passed and enacted assisted suicide laws, most of the states that had it were pretty much predominantly white states. And as assisted suicide kind of gets normalized in this country and as it spreads to more diverse states, I had predicted that we're going to see an uptick in Black and brown folks requesting it due to circumstances and coercion, and all. And unfortunately, that's been proven true. Certainly in California and in Colorado, there has been an incremental rise in Black and brown folks requesting assisted suicide. And I also, predicted, and I think we're going to see that, is that as people lose access to healthcare, access to pain medications, in states where assisted suicide is legal, that's going to affect our communities further because, we love our families and we don't want to put financial burdens, on our families, especially when our families are already poor. And as assisted suicide is being normalized and as Compassionate Choices is making inroads into the Black community, especially among the Black professional class, we can see this happening, even more. And it's quite frightening, to be honest.
Do you think the adoption with more Black people or colored people want to go with assisted suicide is due to the fact that they doesn't have a say in what's going on, or simply they are mentally coerced into making that decision?
Well, I think part of it has to do with racial disparities in healthcare and how doctors tend to devalue the lives of Black and brown folks particularly when we have disabilities or elderly or poor. Um, People will, convince you, that assisted suicide is a good thing. Doctors will try to pressure you. There are cases of doctors of patients overhearing doctors talking to family members, overhearing doctors talking to patients and saying, think of your family. You don't want to do this to your family. And so you're right in that in racial disparities in healthcare, we don't have that voice. And so doctors tend to be gatekeepers of that, and they tend to decide
Okay.
if your life is worth it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, John, I want to ask you this question. COVID, right? Since this topic is more on the quality of life, and we had tens of thousands of Black people who had COVID and passed. Do you think they had a survival chance, or simply because of this quality of life, they deemed that you're no longer fit to live, so why should we waste our oxygen on you or try to make you any better? You're going to die anyway. Do you think that could have been an attitude or a result in so many Black people dying for the mere fact that they are now examining quality of life?
Well, I think they're really applying this across the board, especially to people with intellectual disabilities. This quality of life, walking, talking.
Right.
And, the way the promoters of these laws talk, it really is about quality of life. As Thaddeus Pope said to me in the debate, that yes, it's all about disability, and it's what anyone finds intolerable. And something Anita brings up often is that in Oregon, you can qualify as terminal if you can't afford your treatment or if your treatment is stopped. And legalization makes assisted suicide a medical treatment, a so-called benefit, to be extended to ever more people. Assisted suicide will always be the most profitable and cost-effective treatment. Then we've got abuse. Like 1 in 10 elders is estimated to be abused every year, and we see cases of coercion where the family wants the person to die. And, like one case with Kate Cheney, she had a choice between living in a nursing home or doing assisted suicide, so she finally chose assisted suicide. And then another thing is misdiagnosis. It's estimated that 12 to 15% diagnosed terminal, as in dying within 6 months, are not really dying. And so, we ask progressives, hey, you oppose the death penalty in part because innocent people get executed, like 4%. And here we've got 12 to 15%, 4 times as many people. Don't these people's lives have value? And Anita, maybe you could talk about your mom.
Well, whenever we talk about doctors making mistakes in the in diagnosing a patient as terminal, I think about that day in June of 2009 when I got the frantic call from my mom's doctor. My mom, I lived in New York, as I do now, upstate New York. My mom lived in Seattle, Washington. At the time, Seattle had, like, weeks before enacted their assisted suicide law. The doctor called me and told me that if I wanted to see my mom alive, that I needed to get to Seattle, Washington within 2 days. And so I did. My mom rallied. Obviously she was quite glad to see me. And so she rallied. And so by the time I left, she was still in her home. So there, that prediction didn't, was certainly more than 2 days. Eventually, my mom went into hospice. The doctors kept saying that her body was in the process of dying, that she was in the end stages of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And she was placed in hospice. And they kept telling us that her body had begun the process of dying. 6 months later, she was still in hospice. At that point, you have survived your hospice, graduated from hospice. But the doctor had still convinced my mom that she was in the process of dying. And my mom decided that she wanted to go home to Colorado to die. And so we made the arrangements to get my mom home to Colorado. We put her in her own apartment, and she settled in and basically waited to die. 6 weeks later, she was in Washington, D.C., getting arrested, fighting for disability rights. We had my mom for almost 12 years. My mom just passed away on February 1st of 2021. And at any point, in Washington, D.C., the doctor tried so hard to convince my mom that she was dying.
Right. So
At any point, she could have requested assisted suicide and been given the medication because she had been determined to be terminal.
Right.
And so that's really scary.
Yeah.
People outlive
Right. So that's
their
what
terminal diagnosis.
How many more years did your mom live after the doctor was pushing her down the road to accept assisted suicide?
My mom lived, this was in 2009. My mom lived from June 9, 2009 to February 1st, 2021.
Lord,
so we had her almost 12 years after her diagnosis of being terminal.
Well, John and Anita, we come to the end of our program. And I want to say thank you very much for coming on today and educating us on the history of our healthcare system and assisted suicide. I hope that sometime in the near future we can carry on with this, because I think our society needs to know what's going on. The public need to be aware of what's going on within our communities. So until then, take good care. John, Anita, it was a pleasure having you. And to all those who have been tuning in, thank you.